Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the DCL Learning Series. You're in for a real treat today. We've got a webinar that's entitled Content from Multiple Clinical Sources, the Pitfalls and Solutions to Consistent Documents and Content. If you don't know me, my name is David Turner, and I'm a content consultant and also head of partner relations at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. A couple of quick things before we get started. I do want to just remind everybody the webinar is being recorded. It'll be available in the on-demand section of our website at dataconversionlaboratory.com. If you have any trouble with that, just reach out to me and I'll make sure that you get the right link. Second thing is I just want to invite you to submit any questions at any time during the conversation today. We're going to save some time at the end to answer questions. So if you got them, just feel free to jump in and use the questions feature there. All right, let me jump over here to this next slide here. So obviously technology plays a really critical role in life sciences because you've got things like accuracy to worry about, traceability, compliance, and of course speed to market. It's just absolutely critical. So by improving content management and data management, along with your IT systems, compliance, program management, all of this works to streamline both research and drug development. So with that in mind, Data Conversion Laboratory and Court Square Group and Jana Life Sciences have put together this learning series to really address how technology can contribute to your success. This is actually the fifth, if you look here on this slide, the fifth webinar of a series of 7 webinars, and the other webinar topics are listed here. And I will say this, while today's webinar does build on our previous webinars that were all about technology and content management, you'll still gain a lot of insight today, even if you hadn't followed the entire series. But if you do want to go back and follow the entire series, it's easy to get to. We've got transcripts and videos on the Data Conversion Laboratory website, and we'll push a link to that page via the chat box, which I think has already been done by Leanne. Thanks so much, Leanne. All right, just quickly about DCL. This webinar series is brought to you by Data Conversion Laboratory, or DCL as we're also known. Our mission in the marketplace is to structure the world's content. So our services are all about things like converting content, structuring content, enriching content, and data. And we're one of the leading providers of XML transformation services, XML conversion services, also content reuse analysis. We're an industry expert who's been a part of SPL conversion and the SPL working group for global pharma companies for many, many years. So if you have any complex content and data challenges or initiatives, those are the kinds of things where we can help. All right, let's jump in and let me just introduce our panelists today, 3 good friends of mine. First of all, we have Mr. Mark Gross, who is the president of Data Conversion Laboratory. We'll hear from him momentarily. We've also got Keith Parent, who's the CEO at Court Square Group, who I think a number of you know. And then out on the West Coast, we got Ron Niland, the president of Jana Life Sciences, who I think some of you also know. So glad to have everyone here today. Let's get this thing kicked off. I'm going to start by passing it over to you first, Keith. Keith from Court Square Group, why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Hi, David. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be on this webinar series for the 5th time. This has been a great series so far. Court Square Group is a provider of an audit-ready compliant cloud environment. So we host many applications in the life science space, particularly around document management, content management, integrating multiple applications together. We actually have a Redactions 365 platform as well that hosts clinical content, and we host many different clinical trials using that content. We have submission systems for people to submit to the FDA or other health authorities. We're heavily involved in AI research and what's going on with AI with the content in these documents. And our goal is to really kind of look at the cloud environments that are out there, work with them across the board, and connect the world as we can in the life science world.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's move on over and let's let Ron jump in here and talk a little bit about Jana.
Thank you very much, David. And yeah, like Keith, I would echo the same sentiment in terms of taking part in the series. It's been a real learning opportunity for us, and we appreciate the partnership with both DCL and Court Square Group. Jana is a company that was formed in 1973, Jana Inc. that is, and we're a division, Jana Life Sciences. We have not only 48 years of experience and working with thousands of projects, but with some of the world's major corporations. One of those is Boeing, and for a handful of years out of the last 8, we've been a Performance Award, Excellence Award winner with Boeing. What we do is basically 4 things. We do technical documentation. We then do what falls under the umbrella of operational excellence, IT systems, and program management. We work with a multitude of formats, including XML and DITA, and we have a projectized organization. At the heart of each one of our efforts are project managers who work with teams, and basically we are not only ISO 9001 2015 compliant, but we're also working toward ISO 13485 in the here and now. We'll be certified with that probably in the September, October timeframe. But basically we do technical documentation, procedural documentation, how-to manuals, user manuals, maintenance manuals as examples, operating procedures and work instructions, and we do training associated with that. And we move mountains of data, and that's an overview of Jana.
Wonderful, wonderful. What both of these guys didn't tell you is all the years of experience that they have in working in different parts of life sciences. So really expert panelists here today, and glad to have them. So before we get too much further, Ron, I'm going to hand it back to you in just a second, but I thought I would start with a quick poll. So I'm going to load this poll here that talks about where is your organization in terms of consolidating content from multiple sources. Boom, 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 and I'm hereby launching the poll. All right, if you'll take just a minute, kind of stretch a little bit, think about where you are in terms of this this process, and fill out the answers. We'll collect the responses here. I think we've got about 25% in so far. All right, bumping up a little bit, about 50%. Those of you who are thinking, I don't want to vote, go ahead, vote. Come on. Very nice, a little longer here. All right. Still time, about 10 more seconds. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Thank you, everybody, for that. Let's see here. In terms of sharing this thing, let me put that up here. All right, so what we got in our poll responses are really kind of interesting. And it was funny when we, as the poll was going out, it started out almost everyone that answered was just starting to think about it. And then kind of the second half of the minute that we sat there, we got the well on our way towards embracing it with multiple processes. It's interesting, we received no responses for either of the other ones. So very interesting. All right, well with that, let me close this poll back out. Boom. And we'll get back to our webinar, where let me pass it over to Ron, where you can talk about the overview of the webinar today.
Sure, thanks, David. Basically, today we'll be talking about a half dozen or so concepts that really range from the idea of accessing information, managing it, analyzing it, and then ultimately presenting it. What we hope to do is give you some insights to what it means to do a mapping of that information, give you sort of insights as to the melding process of it, and then how data is then migrated, consolidated, and in that process harmonized so that you can have that end game of, again, being able to look at your data, access it readily, manage it readily, analyze it and present it, and reuse it. That's going to be one concept that we want you to sort of, hopefully at the end of this webinar, appreciate the potential for the reuse of your information. Working with a multitude of vendors, sponsors usually then have this role where they need to bring together that information from the vendors. And then there's an aspect of not just bringing it together, but understanding who's the keeper of the keys for the information. So those are some of the elements that we'll talk about. We'll talk about some of the issues that happen invariably when you bring that data in. You know, issues like PDFs aren't necessarily scannable or searchable, that is. And then we'll talk about the idea of the formatting that will lead to the harmonization. And then again, we'll sort of put a capstone on this presentation by talking about the summary data. Next slide, please. So the first question is, you know, what is all of this clinical content? And it obviously depends on your organization, whether you're a producer of biologics or pharmaceuticals or medical devices. But this sort of gives you a little sense, if you will, of those types of documents. And we broke them into three larger buckets here. The first is around study planning and execution. The second is around the idea of the study itself and its generation of data, either during the study or at the end of the study. And then the last sort of bucket here is a miscellaneous bucket. Each one of these can be parsed and are to very finite or more discrete levels. But if we just talk about, let's say, study planning and execution, you know, this is the aspect of bringing in information associated with understanding the certifications of the bodies that are associated with the development efforts, the contracts that may be, again, associated with these parties. And then there could be either amendments to those contracts or even amendments to the protocols that may be executed in doing that clinical research. All of this obviously has to fall under certain regulations. Those would be sort of good clinical practices and GXPs more generally. You've got patient-related information like informed consent and general study information. So that's sort of the first bucket. The outputs of this, then, if we think about clinical development, one of the end games is the idea of that clinical study report, obviously. But in order to get there, there's an amount of data that needs to be generated. That includes things like data clarification forms and electronic data capture, the idea of then information coming in from patients like in e-diaries or their electronic medical records. There's a whole host of imaging information that can come in that can be added within the electronic medical record for sure. Sometimes it's managed separately. You've got laboratory findings, and then there are aspects of quality of life and disease-specific instruments that are being developed and basically run with patients, and those responses need to be gathered. Safety reports, obviously, throughout the life of a study and even thereafter. And then there's the SAS data sets and the generation of those. So that's sort of study-related outputs, and the mixed bag of miscellaneous that really runs the gamut from email correspondence to references and reports, specifications and controls. But that just is some of the clinical content that we as a collective unit will work with firms such as yours. Next slide. So where does the study information generate or originate? It's a multitude of sources. It could run from the study sponsors to the sites. At the site level, you can have the investigators and their respective information. You've got other clinicians that may be associated with the care of the patient that are providing information maybe to an investigator. Perhaps it's a cardiology study and that patient has a cardiologist that they've seen for a number of years and they're working together with the investigator for the trial. You've got contract research organizations and researchers at both the academic and government level. You've got laboratory information coming through. Again, we talked about patient diaries, and you've got managed care organizations, acute care organizations, medical writers, funders. The list goes on. And we can't forget about the lawyers, as well as the governing bodies associated with the conduct of a study, whether it's an institutional review board or ethics committees. And for the safety, then you've got the data monitoring committees as well. Next slide. So, where does all of this information come from, right? It's a multitude of sources, and there's an aspect of the functional view of that information too that we need to think about. At the top of the wheel, we put manufacturing, and it really depends with a company. If we're talking about, let's say, pharmaceuticals, it may start more with the discovery side. But the fact is, each one of these functions come into play on the clinical side because they're perhaps helping to either grease the skids, if you will, of the clinical development, producing maybe the clinical supplies, or taking the information from that study and preparing it for regulatory bodies. And each one of these functions is working with a number of different types of documents, and the inputs and outputs are a little bit different. But some of the systems that come into play, obviously there's the QMS, person and foremost, just ensuring that you've got the right procedural framework for the work to be conducted. That's the SOPs and work instructions and enabling documents. We talked about the idea of manufacturing and the clinical supplying and having that ensured to be ready for the clinical program. And sometimes that actually takes years of pre-work, if you will, before you get into a phase one. You've got your general content management system, and then on the clinical side, you've got the more specific trial master file system, the ETMF, the electronic version of that. At the enterprise level, you may have sort of your accounting systems like your ERP that need to be tapped into. If you're producing products, you might have a product lifecycle management system. Each one of these then might be generating information associated with analytics, so you need to think about all of these. And then from a regulatory perspective, you've got the regulatory information management, and perhaps you have a RIM system in place, and maybe you don't. Maybe you've cobbled together a few different systems. And again, the lawyers with their legal management and e-discovery elements, these are some of those sources of the systems that we'll touch on as we go on. Next slide, please. And so, in this graphic here, you're seeing 3 different studies. Basically, we've replicated the image of what's happening in that study with an investigator in green, interacting perhaps with that computer and providing information. In the lower left of each one of these images, you can see there are patient charts being referenced. And then in the lower right, you've got ancillary data, and that could be the imaging data. And up in the upper left, you've got the electronic medical records. And with this information coming together for a particular study, you may have a series of vendors. And again, those vendors may have a series of systems. So you can imagine how this starts to mushroom out. And then if you've got a multitude of studies, like in this case 3, you may have 3x vendors and 3x systems that you need to think about for this continuum of data management and the data management group working with that information, medical writers working with it, and then ultimately the regulatory body, the regulatory group working with it and queuing it up for presentation to a regulatory authority. So that aspect of this data and tracking and tracing it, if you will, through is something that you need to safeguard, because ultimately you need to make sure your information is validated so that that compilation, that submission to regulatory bodies is accepted as bona fide data that's again been fully validated where necessary, that is.
Ron, it's interesting when you're talking about the amount of data and where the data comes from. As I've been dealing more with different organizations and actually doing a lot with biologics or regenerative medicine, you're also getting to the point where some of this is more broadly stroked across, a series of studies for a particular drug product. But then when you're starting to get into regenerative medicine, where you're actually taking cells out of patients and dealing with biologics and pulling in patient data, it's actually a place where you're getting more distinct around that data for a particular patient and making sure you're tracking and tracing those particular elements all the way through the process, particularly if you're going to go into some kind of manufacturing or dealing with the cells where they're going to be infected with a virus and then brought back into the patient. So you're tracking it all the way from where it gets gathered with the patient all the way through when it gets put back into the patient. So the concept of a needle-to-needle study is something that's out there, or needle-to-needle work is something that people are starting to think about more on how that works and how they have to track even at that minute level all the way through. So I think it's really interesting the way we look at certain things at a much broader picture when it's maybe a large molecule or small molecule, and then when you look at large molecules with the biologics and stuff, it's really changing over the course of time. It's not so much the type of data or how we handle the data, but it could be the volumes of data, or even how many people touch that data around, whether it could be a clinical supply chain or something like that deals with it.
No, those are great points, Keith. And what's happened over the years is we went from sort of blockbuster pharmaceutical agents to more targeted biologics and targeted pharmaceuticals. But now it's moved to the next stage, i.e. precision medicine, where it's very customized to that individual. It's based on their cellular makeup, their genetic makeup. And to your point, it's like a white glove kind of service offering. If we're talking about cell therapy, that you need to be not just managing that logistical chain from the point of extracting cells, manufacturing them, and reinfusing them, but just ensuring that the safety, the integrity, the validity of that associated information.
And the inventory capabilities around that too. We talk a lot about the clinical data and the actual documents coming in and the data coming in from some of those things. But even like on the manufacturing side, the inventory capabilities around tracking and tracing of all those things all the way through. When I first started, we used to have issues around tracking and tracing of big lots of pharmaceuticals going out there, and who was getting what, and then how's it tied back to the manufacturing process and which lot was out there. Now it's at those minute areas. So again, it gets back to volumes of data and being more specific around where things are going and where they are in the supply chain as well.
No, great points.
No, I think that's actually an excellent point in terms of just the volumes of data that are coming along, and just you're tracing it by bottle, and so you really it's not just that it's orders of magnitude more information that's being collected, and along with that comes the issues of the quality of the data, making sure that it's being traced correctly, and that it's going all the way across, and that it's auditable. So all the issues we've been talking about become more and more important over time by orders of magnitude, not just a little bit.
No, that's a great point, Mark. And just to build on that, one further step here is the idea of not just the information increasing, but the expectation of the fidelity of that information. Meaning, if we talk about imaging as an example, a certain pixel presentation 5 years ago may no longer be acceptable for then, let's say, looking at an oncology scan and trying to then do that assessment. And not only is it the fidelity of that scan that's so much greater, but then what we're doing is we're layering levels of information on top of these images, such as annotations by clinicians. So the volume is increasing, and the overall memory requirements are increasing too.
Why don't we move on to a couple more slides? Because I think that same point that I just made, I think we're going to bring up in a couple other areas. So as we get into the content mapping and the summary aspects of it, we'll talk a little bit more about cross-institutional and even within your own institution, cross-departmental. So let's pop onto that.
Sounds good.
Please. So when we talk about cross-institutional factors, we talk a lot about where is that data coming from and what are the systems that people are using. One of the key things that I see over time is that it used to be that IT always drove everything that was happening. And as we start to become more open with cloud-based systems and different applications that are very specific to different areas within a company, you may be dealing with multiple cloud platforms. In the last webinar series we did, we talked about some of the cloud factors and how we dealt with those different things. And in here, what we want to do is emphasize the fact that even within an organization, I may be dealing with lots of different cloud environments and the interaction of the same data going between multiple systems. And for us in the life science world, we really have to worry about qualification and validation and how all that works together. So I want to make sure that when we're talking about these, we look at who are the major vendors that we're dealing with. Do people understand life science versus the regular commercial world that's out there, or the consumer world, which doesn't have the rigor for that what we need? They can take downtime for certain things or different issues that they deal with. Whereas for us, we have to make sure that it's an end-to-end process between different environments and how we kind of pull that stuff together. So our goal would be to make sure that we understand the vendors that we're working with, we understand how they're working on it. You can go to the next slide, please. In this example, we talked about this, and we had another kind of a funnel design of this, talking about how you may have an EDMS system where we've got lots of data coming in from the different sources. To Ron's slide earlier, when we were talking about all the different areas where the data was coming in, there's a lot of data that comes in from whether it's CMC, preclinical, clinical systems. Those are all going to be then taken, aggregated together. Medical writers are going to put that stuff together. Data management folks are going to put it into SAS data sets and then take those SAS data sets and create tables out of them. They're going to be fed off to the medical writers. Everything's going to then be pushed off to regulatory, who then is going to take it and put links between documents so they can actually put it through a validator that knows that it's going to go to the FDA or the EU or Health Canada or any of the regulatory bodies that we're going to be talking to. Well, those are all interactions internally or externally, because you may have an external vendor. You may have a CRO that's doing some of that work. You may have a submission company that's doing some of that work for you. They may need to take in lots of data from that. They may need to clean up data. You know, I recently started working with a company that did an internal project just to find out how much time of their time was spent on searching and rework of data, cleaning the data, doing stuff with data. And they found that 40% of most of the people's time that they had surveyed within their own organization was spent in searching for and just cleaning data that they already had. So imagine if we were able to identify that data, set it so that it was much more cleanly delineated and usable, and then how it could go much easier between multiple vendors. Because part of that cleaning comes from the fact that different vendors do different things with stuff, and we have to worry about how that data comes in. Are they keeping the metadata that's supposed to be there, or they're keeping all the issues that are there? So Mark and Ron, you guys see this as well with the stuff that you're working on?
Oh, absolutely. Mark?
Yeah, and I think your numbers are consistent across many other places. I mean, that I'm not surprised at a number like 40% is being is just cleaning up data and figuring out how it belongs together. So that's why the standardization kind of things that we're talking about are just so critically important. If you can cut out 40% of that process, imagine what kind of improvements you can put in there. Not only that, but also reduces the chances of errors later on, because if you've got that kind of thing going on where people are spending so much time cleaning data, imagine what the risk is of missing something along the way. So
yeah.
Absolutely.
The practice of getting it right the first time.
What I've found that there's an increasing distribution of work product. You know, 30 years ago, there was an embracing idea around working with major CROs. And now today, what I'm finding is that when it comes to studies, companies that we're interacting with are working with at least 15 or so parties. You know, maybe they do have a major CRO, and maybe that CRO is overseeing even you know, a handful of or more of sub vendors. But then the hybrid model that I'm seeing increasingly is where the sponsor is interacting with a series of vendors, and then they have a CRO working with a series of vendors. And so it's what gets muddied here is understanding who's got the parent data, who's got the child data, and who's really taking the responsibility for doing the information architecting. And so the idea of 40% doesn't surprise me.
one of the things I want to make sure that people realize is that we made this as a series because our experiences over time showed that there's lots of things that come together to drive solutions for anybody. And some of those things are how we define the data. Some of those things are how we put together what's known as an information architecture. Some of those things are the rules around how we deal with the data. But all those things in any one time, we'd sit here for a week going through all those things with you. So by cutting it down into small pieces and doing them over a series of this learning series, we're going to give you an aspect of how these kind of things tie together. So this particular day, talking about how these things kind of tie together, builds upon some of the things that we talked about earlier, particularly around metadata, things like that. Now, Mark's going to go into a few of those things later on, but right now, we just want to kind of move on to the next step, which is going to be migration of data. So David, you can move that along. There we go.
Yep.
So looking at how they migrate the data between these systems and how we can then consolidate some of that data is going to be really important. Next. So content migration, making sure that it's a validated process of migrating data from any one place to another, maintaining the integrity of the documents themselves and what they do and how they work. That's going to be really important in understanding how are we dealing with that data across the way, and if it's large volumes of data, is it somebody moving them by hand, or is it a bulk upload process, a download process? Are they retaining the metadata and the taxonomy? Those are those things that we talk about that we rely on for giving us that structure later on. And if the processes that you've fallen upon don't take those into account, then what will happen is you'll lose some of that. So you may start out early on in one section or one area within the company, but then because you're using somebody else's system, as Ron was illustrating earlier, it may lose some of that. Our goal is to say, how do we figure out how to maintain the fidelity of that data all the way through the process and make sure that it stays there, even through the migration aspect of things.
Yeah, just further to the point here, Keith, I've seen a few situations where companies have moved data from a vendor and they put it into this temporary holding area. They might call it a repository content management system. But the question is whether that was validated and safeguarded, right? Because if that data gets placed into a non-validated system, you know what happens here, Keith, right? Basically you've got oil in the tank of water, and that water is no longer useful to drink, meaning you can't use that data for a submission if it was intended and needed to be kept in a validated environment throughout its life cycle, if you will.
Absolutely, 100%. Next, Dave. So a couple things that we're going to talk about now is just some of the things that we've seen across the board in either whether it's through vendors, through individual groups, through sites, through CROs, through sponsors themselves, and what some of the pitfalls that we've had to deal with and how we've overcome some of them. Some of the things that I've seen are the loss of fidelity, and Ron had mentioned earlier about scanned images and things coming in. How often, some people, take for granted that everything's electronic these days. Well, the reality is some of these sites where they're sending in CRF forms or whatever are coming in on a fax machine, or they're going to be scanned in. Somebody actually may have printed it out and then scanned it in and then sent it to somebody, and it could lose that. The other concept is some of the vendors on the electronic side of things are coming out with new ways of embedding documents together within multiple documents. Well, not every application can deal with that. So what happens is all of a sudden you may get a document that has this really neat looking little icon in it, but it's not actually the document itself that you need because it needed to be expanded for what was there. We find emailing issues and things like that, or attachments are coming in, or sometimes you're going to have we'll get audited, or our clients will be audited, and they'll look and they'll find that there's this big email TST file that's got all these embedded emails. Well, somehow how are you going to go through that and search all of them and pull data out of that? Again, rendering issues. If somebody's rendered a document using the wrong PDF rendering solution and it doesn't keep the right fonts or formats that you need from an FDA submission, those are things. Or if you've given up some of your control to somebody else, are they actually going to be able to hit what you needed to do? So you got to make sure of that when you're dealing with people. And you guys can jump in at any time you want to talk about any of these real world content issues. I know that you're seeing the same things that we see on a very regular basis. Some of the other things that we see is you can't search those images. If an image comes through, and it hasn't been OCR'd, optical character recognition, and you can actually see the data. And typically, when we have a document management system, we want to have something that is indexing everything all the way through the document, through the metadata, but then also through the content, so we can actually find those things. Well, if it's not searchable, if you can't OCR it or you haven't set it up that way, it's just one image and you can't get to it. So it's going to be important that you kind of do that and understand how you make sure that it's searchable. If the zip files are in there, or bundled documents, and you can't get those documents out of it. There are no naming conventions, and all of a sudden, and that was one thing Ron had mentioned earlier when he talked about, migrating the data, and sometimes you'll get the data in, somebody will start using that data and they won't follow the naming conventions that were started with, or they've come up with a different naming convention. Now you can't tie some of those documents back together, and now nobody knows where the source of truth was. And the goal was to try to figure out how does it go back to the original document. Those are things. Or even multiple copies of the same file in different folders. Which one is the real one? Which one, or are you going to have to constantly be doing comparisons between multiple documents? Those are things that we're trying to avoid at all costs, because that's where that waste is going to come in to what you're working on.
Right, and all the version control that comes along in multiple copies. And you mentioned before OCR. I mean, yes, you can OCR it, but then what's the quality of image and how good is the OCR? Is it good enough for the kind of applications we're talking about over here? Usually in these kind of systems, it's not proofread to make sure it's all correct. If it came in as a copy of a fax that got refaxed, you probably have very little that's accurate in there. So these are all things we see all the time. Yeah.
Well, particularly around somebody putting like wet signatures on things, they feel like they've got to print it out and do a wet signature, and then they scan it in to send it back to somebody. Those are very common issues that we're running into on a big thing. I know that Ron and I spoke a little bit earlier about vendors dropping or incorrectly setting metadata on some of the things, on some of the documents. They may send summarized files instead of the data that's in there, and I've seen this before where you have an outside vendor, they'll put stuff together, and all of a sudden it'll come with headers and footers and watermarks and all sorts of other stuff that they make it almost impossible to use some of those documents that you're getting. They think they're doing a great job because they're protecting that document, but the reality is it makes that document less usable for what we're really trying to do something with. And we need to be able to facilitate the transfer and receipt of the documents between systems without having some of those extra characteristics that they're adding into that. So those are important things that we think about when we're dealing with integration, particularly between multiple systems, or one system is going to feed another system and drive some of that usability.
Yeah, and one situation I've seen a little bit is that companies, they, from a sponsor perspective anyway, they have a tendency to work with certain vendors. And if they're doing, let's say, clinical development, and they have a series of studies, the studies sometimes are cloned, and you get little variants in this study versus that one, and maybe there's a Japan-specific arm to it, but they start to look a little bit alike, and the vendors sometimes literally get confused. And I've seen a situation where a vendor presented data back to the sponsor for a trial, and it was not the correct data. And it was for a similar study in the portfolio, but they got it wrong, and the submission ended up not being in a position where they expected it to be, and it required some rework for sure. But this is where, going back, there's that aspect of engaging with the vendors, and not only just talking about who's responsible for what in terms of the execution of the trial, but there really needs to be a very high level understanding of who's managing that data and the documents and the associated taxonomies and the architecting, if you will, so that it's very clear what data sets are associated with which studies and what have you, so that at the end of the day, is, with it being fast and furious and trying to get to market as quickly as possible, a mistake isn't made, a baton is not dropped.
Right. I mean, Ron, what you mentioned over here about slight differences in places is a major issue, not just over here, but just all over, because we're so used to now the concept of cut and paste and take something over and change something a little bit. We've built specific software. There's a product we have called Harmonize that'll go specifically for that purpose to go across 100 documents and find all the similar paragraphs there, because that's, people are doing this all the time, and it's very easy for mistakes to creep in. So I think it's interesting that you bring that up. I guess I was going to talk. I mean, what I've got here could probably take a whole session by itself, but I think I just really taking off on what Keith has been talking about maintaining the about what happens as you move documents from place to place, and the importance of moving away from just having images and copies of faxes and stuff like that into a more structured system. And the issue of as people move things from one system to other, they lose a lot of information. And this goes into not just that the text isn't exactly accurate when you're taking OCR of an image, but also you're losing information about the documents. And you have to make sure that you're keeping that. Taxonomy and metadata about documents gets lost when you just do a copy and paste from one place to another. I guess we're calling drag and drop, or I call cut and paste from the days when I was actually cutting and pasting. When you're dealing with large amounts of documents, as we're talking about over here, you have to make sure to engineer the process as you're taking it from one place to another, that you don't lose that metadata. You don't assume that it's going to be there. And if you lose it, you're going to end up having to do it again, and all the risk of making errors and things like that. Next slide, please.
Well, Mark, I think the point about losing that metadata, we talked about that 40% of wasted time. When you lose that metadata, you could have used that metadata to set up views or to find that data, things like that. When you lose it, that's where that time has to come in, because once you don't have the metadata, you got to figure out a different way of being able to find that same document. And that's a big part of that process.
Absolutely. And I think actually the redactions is another example of losing information that's in that document. When you look at documents because of PHI and PII issues, a lot of information gets redacted, like sometimes the whole thing becomes black. But realize the information behind it has to be somewhere. It's just been, a mark has been put there to tell you that when it's displayed, that piece is redacted. So the system itself and the way you use information, you have to make sure that you're keeping track of that, because the information is really back there. So how do you know that when you transfer this record over, somebody can't get into the information you intended to redact? And vice versa, how do you know that when you transfer information over, that you was redacted at a certain point, when you need to get to it, do you have the correct information behind there? So these are all things that are, become much more important as you've gone to electronic methods of redaction, and as the issues of privacy have become such a much larger issue. It sometimes overwhelms a whole project, both in here, the legal aspects later on, and all along. Next slide, please.
Oh, if I could
just
say,
and actually, Mark, go ahead, Ron.
Just real quick, the other element, and you were touching on it, is like later, right? What happens later? The archiving of information is a requisite with regulatory bodies around the globe. They will say often, you need to save this information for 20, 25 years. And the aspect of the metadata, again, the preservation of it, and also the aspect of the redaction, those come into play with what's been sort of hermetically sealed in an archive that needs to be available if that regulatory body wants to see it 5, 10, 20 years from now.
Right. And how do you keep both versions in sync? And
I was also going to mention, when you're talking about the redaction, the whole issue that as the industry starts to change and we're doing more distributed trials and more adaptive trials, all of a sudden now data is shifting over the course of a trial and things like that, and different people are getting involved. We're actually doing more patient level data gathering as part of some of these. Sometimes it was basically for observational registries or things like that, but now some of that are being embedded right into some of the trials, and it's going to be important that we understand how do we deal with that kind of data along the way, particularly when we're going to be using multiple people dealing with that data and consolidating that.
Right, right. Just seemed much easier when you just had patient, this patient IDs that traveled all over, but now they're not really doing that anymore. Yeah. So I was going to give actually what's probably like a 3-minute overview of XML and SPL, and I mean the whole issue. I think part of this is leading to that. It's really important to get information as structured as possible as early in the process, and to the extent you can save a lot of that 40% that gets lost on the way. So XML is really I mean, really talking about structured data, but really XML is the is the current state of the art in how you structure information. And actually, if you go to the next slide, like you just did, so what is structured information? What is XML? What is structured information? Structured information means that instead of just having the text that you see in front of you, you've also gone in and tagged in the specific things that are really important to you. Like this is the back of a journal article, but what's important over here is not just to read it across, because that doesn't really, it's hard to tell what's what, but also you want to be able to identify what is an author and what's the name of the journal, what is the date that a journal is published, all those kind of things that's the metadata about that article that's embedded right over here. And so what you're doing is separating just the text away from what identifies what the text is about. So what does that mean? If we had a slide over here showing you what XML looks like, many of you have not seen XML. It's not really as scary as it looks over here, especially when all this color coding has been put in over here. It's not just the text is identified, but now you've identified, like over there, Singh is a surname and Sanjay is the given name, and that's one author. Then there's a second author, and this is a structure that's identified elsewhere by a map of what the structures look like. Which is called a schema. So and each item in there is identified in that way. So now what you looked at is just a bunch of text that, if you didn't know what order it was in, you wouldn't really know what it is. Here, everything is identified by what it is. So that's what XML looks like. Let's go to the next slide. But that's not the way people read it. People will see it on a screen. And actually, go to the next slide and we'll come back to this, I think. So taking that away from there, let's look, many of you are familiar with structured product labeling and SPL. Well, SPL is a form of XML where you're doing the same thing, not just for a journal article, but here it is for a whole drug submission, not for a drug submission, but for the drug information. And thank you. Going into that, you identified information that's involved over there. This is the standardized format for what an SPL filing would look like. So it tells you what the DUNS number is, which is very critical, what the product code is, what kind of material it is, what the manufacturing sequence is, all the kinds of things that are involved that are needed that are otherwise going to be in text, but it's not necessarily in a particular form. It gets put into these kinds. So that's really extending what we looked at before as a simple XML format to something that might have hundreds of identified items on it, all of them very critical, and now you've identified explicitly. Now, going back to the previous slide, this is not the way you would look at it. Once you've identified everything, this is the way you would end up looking at it. You want to enlarge that one. So this is what it looks like. Now, what it will look like on a in a human readable form on the screen. Because you've identified each of those items, the computer can then go and show you a representation. This is a rendering. Keith was talking about the renderings before. This is a rendering of that same information, to show you what's really there. And not only can you render one SPL listing over here, you can render, you can pull together many things and pull out the data from there. So once you've got it in that structured form, not only is it standardized, it can move from place to place internally by you when it goes to the FDA, but then it goes up on these things. And then people can do all kinds of analytics across it, not just on that one drug, but across many other drugs. So that's really a lot of the value of being able to go to a structured format. In particular, this is XML and SPL. I guess go to the next slide.
If I could build on that.
It was supposed to be an 8-minute slide. It's a 3-minute introduction to XML. Well, you want to go back to the previous slide? We now have time.
Yeah, just to build on that, Mark, the aspect of XML, it's the universal translator, if you will, that enables the FDA not only to do cross comparisons within your submission, but comparisons of your product with its safety and efficacy across a multitude of products. And that is exactly where they're going with regards to the initiative called IDMP, the Identification of Medicinal Product. They want the track and trace capabilities all the way down to this granular level so they can really better ascertain the true benefit of your product vis-a-vis a competitor and the true risk of your product, all the way down at the very discrete safety level of side effects. And so that's something that it's here to stay, and it's something that is on the tail end, if you will, in terms of a submission. But I think the theme of this program is you really need to think about that long game of managing your data so that you can present it to the regulatory bodies and ultimately get your product reviewed and approved, and in certain parts of the world, reimbursed, which is the most critical element ultimately.
Right, and just as you mentioned that, I mean, this is SPL and it's mostly a US-based standard, but and it's been in effect for, I guess, for like 15 or 18 years, but now other countries are going to go through the same process. Health Canada is going through a version of this, which is now voluntary, but will probably become mandatory within the next year. Europe is going through that, and we'll have somewhat different approaches to it, but as long as you've got your contents structured in this way, it becomes an easy transaction to the next step.
Yeah.
to moving to these other structured formats in other countries, and like as Ron mentioned, more and more detailed information is going to be needed over time. The structure allows for all of that. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ron, I think, right?
Okay. Yeah, and what we wanted to do was summarize the hour here, if you will, with this last slide. If you could advance to that, please, we'd appreciate it. And when you look at this, there's one key word that we want you to think about, and the idea is reuse. And not only for you as an individual with your company or the institution you're associated with, but also from the regulatory body perspective that we were just talking about a moment ago. They want data presented, the regulatory bodies that is, and you within your company, that data that you can access. And the data, then they want to be able to manage it, and they want to be able to do some cutting, slicing, dicing, working with the Ginsu knives to then present the data in a certain way so they can do certain analyses, and then to ultimately present it back to different bodies. And so if you think of this as your long game for you with your company, for the 40% that maybe haven't gone there yet, and realize I wasn't surprised with this bimodal distribution. Like there's some people that haven't gone there yet. You're probably maybe associated with upstart companies, maybe, and then those that are more sort of evolved. But this model is really sort of predicated on when you work with your team or your vendor, or you're thinking about that regulatory submission, to say, okay, how are we structuring this? How are we ensuring people can access the information, ultimately manage it? And you can see when we talk about managing, there's sets of data and subsets of data, and sort of it sort of expands onward. So this is sort of just a take-home slide that may help to frame discussions with different parties and may help you to better organize and manage your data and documents.
Excellent.
Keith, your thoughts?
Well,
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I was going to say thank you to everybody on this. We are getting close to the end here, so I do want to run a quick poll that we're going to run here. Give our panelists a chance to get a quick drink so we can answer one or two questions. And so let me get that launched here because we're coming up against the hour here. So just quick question, where does your organization struggle with the most? I'm launching the poll now. We'll take about 30 seconds here to let you guys put in your responses. I do want to thank everybody who's attended. Wow, 90% of our attendees have been here start to finish, which is not always usual in webinars. So thank you so much for your attention and your participation. This is great. Going to give us about 5 more seconds here. Oh, this is fascinating. This is fascinating. All right. We had about half vote, and let me share the results here of the poll. Big number on data consolidation and harmonization, and then equal numbers between these other 3 groups. Panelists, you want to comment really quickly on the poll?
Yeah, I'll jump on that for a second, David. So one of the things that I get very involved in are industry working groups, particularly around trying to put together standards that we can use, because it's amazing how often different companies look at things differently because of the way that they're working. So by working with these different industry groups, you can actually help to drive those kind of standards. Recently, I've been working on the DAA RIM working group to put together a RIM standard, and I think it's important for people to look at regulatory information management and understand that if they at least adhere to something, it's a good way to start. We've done a lot of work with EDM and ETMF reference models that came out of the DAA, so I think those are important. But I think those kind of things are really important to look out in the industry that you're in and understand what is it that you can tie onto and help drive some of your decision making.
Excellent.
I would add to that.
Go ahead, Ron.
The content mapping made me think of this book that I just quickly pulled off my shelf. It's entitled, "If you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere." And I think the issue is, if without a map, you're going to be in the dark. And if you're working with vendors, it will get really scary. And so, that's something that definitely it's worth investing in. And sometimes it's nice to bring in a neutral third party to help sort of work through that process. But starting with a map is always a great place because that'll help people to understand sort of the ultimate destination.
The other variation of that I heard is if you don't have a map or a target of where you're going, how do you know you haven't gotten there yet? So
there we go. Yeah.
But no, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, really, there's need to lay out where you're going and what the mapping needs to be, and how to get. You can't just play it by ear anymore. There's just too much information, and it's too serious, and it's too much risk if you don't check every step of the way. And particularly when you're migrating content, consolidating content, moving it around, how do you know that you're getting it right? You have to have the right QA procedures in place at each step of the way to make sure that it doesn't go off that path on that map that you just talked about.
Well, gentlemen, I wish that we'd had more time. There's just there are so many topics we could have just gone a lot deeper on. I think maybe next time we do one of these, we'll do 2 hours. But this is great, and we thank you all for your expertise. Those of you who had submitted questions, we will follow up with you individually on those. And of course, if you think of additional questions, feel free to contact us. Leanne, would you throw my email address in the chat for them, and that way anybody who has additional questions, they can contact me afterwards. We're really happy that you came, and we want to make sure that you get all your questions answered. So anyway, I just do want to finish up by just saying thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists, Ron, Keith, Mark. Really good stuff. Just for everyone out there, just So you'll know the DCL Learning Series does comprise not just webinars, but also a monthly newsletter. We also have a blog. You can access many other webinars related to this topic or content structure, XML standards on the on-demand webinar section of our website, which is, I think, www.dataconversionlaboratory.com/on-demand-webinars. And we hope to see you at future webinars. So everybody have a great day, and this concludes today's broadcast.
Yeah, I just want to thank David for his great work over here and all the behind the scenes that are doing these webinars. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care,
Thanks
guys.
for